It was a peaceful November morning in Grand Junction, Colorado. The kind of day where life moved quietly until it didn't. Inside a well-kept two-story house, something unthinkable had just happened. A mother, a child, gone. The bed was soaked in blood. The jewelry box lay open, its contents scattered across the floor. But there were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no cries for help, only silence. By 4:20 p.m., a shaken man dialed 911. He said he had just come home from work. But what investigators would uncover over the following months would raise one disturbing question. Was the danger ever outside the house at all? If you're a fan of true crime and criminal investigations, you won't want to miss our new book, The Ultimate Book of Serial Killers: 180 Files of the World's Most Notorious Murderers, now available on Amazon. You can also purchase the PDF version directly from our website for instant download. You'll find the link in the video description and in a pinned comment. Now, let's dive into today's case. In the fall of 2001, the calm streets of Grand Junction, Colorado, a quiet city nestled about 200 miles southwest of Denver, were shattered by a disturbing call that would ignite one of the most chilling investigations the region had ever seen. 38-year-old Michael Blagg, a Navy veteran turned production manager, had built what many considered a picture-perfect life. After a decade of military service, he'd settled into a civilian role at Ametek Dixon, a local industrial firm, and shared a tidy two-story home with his wife, 34-year-old Jennifer, and their young daughter, 6-year-old Abby. But on the afternoon of November 13th, the illusion of that idyllic life would come crashing down. At 4:20 p.m., Michael dialed 911. He had just returned from work. His voice, reportedly shaking, described a horrifying scene: blood on the bed, items strewn across the floor, and a home eerily empty. His wife and child were gone. Police rushed to the residence with weapons drawn, unsure if a violent intruder might still be inside. Room by room, they cleared the house, but it was silent. No movement. No one there. Yet something was wrong, terribly wrong. In the master bedroom, a large pool of blood stained the sheets. An open jewelry box lay discarded on the floor, its contents scattered, a detail that initially suggested a burglary. But officers couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no trace of Jennifer or Abby anywhere in the home or in the surrounding area. A full-scale search began within hours. Officers, helicopters, divers, and volunteers scoured the nearby forests and swept the Colorado River using sonar. Hospitals were called. Witnesses were questioned. But every lead ended the same way: nowhere. Neighbors told detectives that nothing unusual had stood out that morning. Michael said he had left for work just before 6 a.m., while Jennifer and Abby were still asleep. He'd tried calling home during the day, but no one answered. That seemed strange, but not alarming. It wasn't until he returned home that the gravity of the situation struck. Police initially considered the possibility of a home invasion gone wrong. perhaps a robbery that escalated. But as they examined the crime scene more closely, troubling inconsistencies emerged. Despite the substantial blood found on the bed, there were no blood trails throughout the house, no smears, no footprints, nothing in the hallway or garage. The home felt sterile, almost too clean. Yet inside Jennifer's parked minivan, investigators discovered small drops that appeared to be blood. This finding triggered more questions than answers. If a violent act had occurred in the bedroom and a body, or two, had been moved to the garage, why was there no visible evidence of that journey? Forensic teams began carefully cataloging every speck of blood, every print, every fiber. Results would take time. But even in those early hours, detectives were growing uneasy. Something felt staged. As the hours turned into days, the initial sympathy for Michael began to shift. The image of a devoted husband and father, deeply embedded in his church and community, began to fracture under the weight of growing suspicion. Why did the scene lack chaos? Why was only the bed soaked in blood? Why were the jewelry items left behind instead of taken? And what exactly was Michael doing between 6 a.m. and the moment he returned home? Within 48 hours of the disappearance, whispers began to circulate. Detectives quietly reclassified the case, from a possible abduction to something far more calculated. Michael appeared on local television, flanked by his mother-in-law, pleading for the return of his wife and daughter. His church rallied behind him, offering prayers, support, and hope. But behind the scenes, investigators were already beginning to view him differently, not just as a grieving husband, but as a possible suspect. The investigation was no longer just about finding Jennifer and Abby. It was about uncovering the truth buried beneath the surface of a seemingly flawless life, and whether the man who had built it also destroyed it. As the investigation dragged on with no leads, frustration began to mount. Search teams had scoured rivers, highways, and woodland areas. Detectives broadened their efforts, combing through state and federal databases for known kidnappers, predators, or anyone with a history of similar crimes. But the trail remained cold. Another day passed without progress, until investigators summoned Michael Blagg for a second round of questioning. This time, they wanted to dig deeper. Michael was asked to revisit everything: his marriage, Jennifer's habits, their daughter Abby's routines. Investigators wanted to know if there had been any tension, any recent arguments, strange phone calls, outside threats, or conflicts with co-workers or members of their church. Michael insisted that everything had been normal. He described Jennifer as loving and devoted, their home as peaceful. He denied any knowledge of enemies or incidents that might raise concern. But when pressed on the possibility of infidelity, his answer took a subtle turn. He said he didn't believe there was another man in Jennifer's life, but admitted he couldn't be entirely sure. That uncertainty would soon take on new weight. While sorting through Jennifer's belongings, detectives opened one of her religious devotionals. Inside, scribbled in the margins, they discovered a handwritten note, seemingly unremarkable at first glance. But the date was significant. It had been written just one day before Jennifer and Abby vanished. The message revealed that instead of going to church that morning, Jennifer had spent time praying with Stanley, seeking guidance for something troubling her. Investigators launched a full inquiry into this mysterious Stanley. Friends, relatives, even fellow churchgoers were questioned. No one knew of a man by that name connected to Jennifer. Then came a revelation. Stanley wasn't a local figure at all. He was Charles Stanley, a nationally broadcast pastor known for his religious television programs. Jennifer had likely been referring to watching one of his sermons. On the broadcast, dated just 2 days before the disappearance, Charles Stanley had forcefully condemned adult content and its destructive effect on Christian families. Suddenly, things began to align. As the digital forensics team dug into the Blagg family computer, they uncovered something unexpected. There was no evidence of Michael having an affair, but there were hundreds of hidden adult images stored deep within the hard drive. The content revealed more than casual browsing. It painted a picture of a man struggling with compulsions he had kept secret from his wife. The images alone didn't prove anything, but in the eyes of investigators, they offered a potential motive, especially when viewed alongside another discovery, an unsent email, time-stamped 3:58 p.m. on the day Jennifer disappeared, just minutes before Michael called 911. In it, he apologized for ruining the day and expressed regret that their problems couldn't be discussed more calmly. The tone was one of tension, not harmony, and it contradicted the narrative Michael had originally shared. Detectives returned to the audio of Michael's emergency call. A troubling detail stood out. Upon entering the house and discovering the blood, Michael never searched the rest of the home, not even Abby's bedroom. It wasn't until the dispatcher specifically asked about his daughter that he went upstairs. The lack of instinctive panic, the absence of a frantic search, did not sit well with the team. Even more curious were the voicemail messages he had left on the family's answering machine. One in particular, left around 3 p.m., was laced with anxious urgency. He was already deeply concerned no one was answering. Yet instead of driving the mere 6 minutes back home, he simply left a message and continued his workday. The inconsistencies were beginning to pile up. Lab results confirmed that the blood found on the bed and in Jennifer's car belonged only to her. Abby's DNA was nowhere to be found, and all fingerprints collected matched only family members. Based on the volume of blood loss, experts concluded that Jennifer likely hadn't survived the attack. But without a body and without any eyewitnesses, police still lacked the definitive proof to make an arrest. Michael remained under quiet surveillance. Officially, he was not charged, but behind the scenes, he had become the prime suspect. 3 months passed. Then, unexpectedly, detectives caught a break, though not the one they anticipated. One day, while reviewing surveillance footage from Michael's workplace, they caught him loading office furniture into his vehicle. Chairs, file cabinets, small equipment, all being removed without authorization. Investigators confronted the company, who confirmed that Michael had no permission to take any of it. It was petty theft, but it spoke volumes. To detectives, it was a telling sign, a man who could present a facade of honesty while living a very different reality beneath the surface. It was a moment that gave investigators pause. What kind of duplicity resided in the mind of a man who wore faith on his sleeve, yet quietly bent the rules for personal gain? Michael was brought in again. The session stretched into hours. Detectives pressed, probing every angle, every inconsistency. They had no bodies, no smoking gun, but they hoped the pressure would cause a fracture in his carefully maintained story. 8 hours into one session, exhausted and emotionally frayed, Michael asked a question that stunned the room. What's the difference between first and second-degree murder? The tone shifted. The mask slipped, just for a moment. Investigators leaned in, asking again, where were Jennifer and Abby? But the opening quickly closed. Michael composed himself, offered nothing new, and the silence returned. But to at least one detective on the case, there was a moment during that questioning, just one, where Michael's voice wavered with something real, something unguarded. They believed it was the only glimpse of truth he'd allowed. Still, it changed nothing. 10 hours of interrogation ended without confession. Michael walked out of the station, free. But the shadows around him were growing darker. The next morning, officers arrived at Michael's new apartment to follow up on the stolen furniture. They knocked. No answer. Silence. Concerned, they called the building manager. When they entered, what they found sent a chill through the team. Michael lay in the bathtub, wrists cut, the water stained red. But he was still alive. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, where it was quickly determined that the wounds were superficial. Not a true suicide attempt, but, investigators believed, a calculated performance, a tactic, a bid for sympathy, and perhaps a distraction. 4 months had passed since Jennifer and Abby vanished. With no new evidence and no bodies, the case stalled. Prosecutors had nothing concrete. Every day that passed without discovery felt like another door quietly closing. Desperate for a breakthrough, authorities launched a massive search operation in April. Over 200 volunteers combed through terrain spanning thousands of square miles. They searched forests, ravines, fields, rivers. For 10 straight days, the teams pressed on. They found nothing. The mood was grim. Leads were exhausted. The frustration was palpable. Yet the team refused to let the case go cold. They held onto a quiet belief. Michael had slipped somewhere, made a mistake. And it was just a matter of time until that mistake revealed itself. That time came, just not in the way anyone expected. Co-workers from Amatec Dixon recalled something odd about the day Jennifer and Abby disappeared. Michael, a production manager, had been seen taking out the trash. Not just once, but repeatedly. It struck them as strange. He never took out the trash. This seemingly minor act took on enormous weight. Investigators began to piece together a theory. What if the bodies had been placed in the company dumpster that day? What if Michael had disposed of them in plain sight and kept an eye on the waste pickup schedule to ensure they were transported to the landfill? The focus shifted. Attention turned toward the Mesa County landfill, a sprawling landscape of industrial waste and decay. Millions of pounds of garbage buried in layers, stretching across acres. The task ahead would be monumental, but it was no longer a question of effort. It was now a question of necessity. The answers, they believed, were buried beneath the trash. And this time, they weren't walking away until they found them. They reached out to the landfill manager, laying out a theory that seemed as improbable as it was disturbing. They believed Michael had used the company dumpster to dispose of his wife's body. The manager hesitated. Digging through millions of pounds of waste was an extraordinary undertaking. But the resolve of the investigators swayed him. With modern waste mapping systems and detailed dump logs, they narrowed the search to a 200 by 300-foot section of landfill, 30 feet deep. Still, it was an overwhelming task. Over 1.8 million square feet of compressed, decomposing garbage. On May 13th, the operation began. Heavy equipment tore into the earth, lifting piles of refuse from the layered grave. Volunteers and forensic teams combed through every heap, searching for anything that didn't belong. But the risks were high. The terrain was unstable, the air toxic, and the deeper they went, the more dangerous it became. Days turned into weeks. The landfill revealed only rot and decay. Spirits began to wane. Doubt crept in. Then, on the 16th day, the unthinkable happened. From the churned debris, a human leg surfaced, twisted, lifeless, barely intact. The moment froze everyone on site. One investigator later described the chaos that followed as surreal. Grown men and women running in every direction, overcome with emotion. No one had truly believed this day would come. Now, here it was. The decomposed remains were transported to the forensic department. The team confirmed what many had feared. The body was Jennifer Blagg. She had been found wearing pajamas. A dental brace remained fixed in her mouth. An autopsy confirmed the cause of death: a single gunshot wound to the head, fired while she was likely asleep. The next step was inevitable. A warrant was issued, and Michael Blagg was arrested at his mother's home. Back at the landfill, the search for Abby continued. Investigators shifted over 4,600 tons of garbage, descending 19 feet into the landfill's depths. But the little girl was never found. After 52 days, the operation ended. The ache of that failure would haunt the team for years to come. 2 years later, the trial began. The prosecution presented a chilling narrative. Michael Blagg had shot his wife in the face as she slept. He then wrapped her body in a nylon tarp, placed her in the family minivan, and dumped her into the work dumpster. He returned home and staged the scene to look like a robbery gone wrong. The defense pushed back, insisting there was no direct evidence linking Michael to the body. No witnesses, no weapon, no confession, all circumstantial. But the weight of the facts told a different story. 5 weeks later, the jury returned with a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of theft against his employer, guilty of a calculated cover-up. Michael Blagg was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He was never charged in connection with Abby's death. Her remains have never been found. Investigators believed control was the motive. The secrets on his computer, the staged crime scene, the desperate attempt to preserve a clean public image, all pointed to a man who would rather destroy his family than face the collapse of his carefully managed life. He never confessed, never admitted guilt. Even after conviction, Michael Blagg maintained his innocence. Years later, in 2014, his conviction was overturned. Not because of new evidence, but because one juror, a woman named Marilyn Charlesworth, had failed to disclose that she was a domestic violence survivor. The defense argued this omission tainted the jury pool. The state retried the case, this time in Jefferson County. 17 years had passed since Jennifer's murder. Witnesses were older, memories faded, but the evidence still stood. Michael was convicted again, on all counts. Life in prison was reinstated. Today, Michael Blagg serves his sentence at the Colorado Territorial Correctional Facility in Cañon City. His appeal was denied in 2018. A 3-judge panel affirmed the ruling. The crime scene had been staged, the weapon traced back to him, the body found wrapped in tarp from his workplace and surrounded by trash originating from his office. The story that began with a trembling voice on a 911 call ended in a cold cell, miles from Grand Junction, where a little girl's fate remains buried in silence. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigations.